World News Today, brought to you by Admiral Corporation, world's largest manufacturer of radio phonographs with automatic record changers. This program is presented in behalf of Admiral dealers all over America. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations and leading news centers in our own country, CBS reporters are waiting to bring you first-hand news from the world's political and battlefronts. Now, here's Robert Trout.
This is the day of prayer, a national day of thanksgiving in the United States and Great Britain. President Truman attended services in Washington, and in London, the King and Queen drove to St. Paul's Cathedral in the first royal procession since the war began. Prime Minister Winston Churchill is preparing to broadcast his review of the war and his 5 years in office. The broadcast on Columbia begins half an hour from now at 3 p.m. Eastern Wartime. In the Pacific, the Tokyo radio says the Japanese home island of Kyushu is being attacked by 900 carrier planes and also by a small force of B-29s. There is no word yet from Allied sources of this enemy-reported carrier attack on Japan, but Tokyo is adding details and says the Japanese planes have found the task force from which the 900 planes were launched, some 220 miles off the southern tip of the southernmost Japanese home island. On Okinawa, the Marines are reported to be slowly smashing their way into Amike, a suburb of the island's capital, Naha. But front correspondents reporting this advance warn us that Naha itself may not fall before at least several days more of this hard street fighting with grenades and flamethrowers. There is also hard fighting on the bypassed island of New Guinea, where Australian troops led by tanks have seized the Wewak airfield and are pushing on to the town of Wewak, the last major Japanese stronghold in northeastern New Guinea. In the Philippines, 2 American divisions are fighting up narrow river valleys to join a 3rd division and cut the island of Mindanao in 2, but the Japanese are resisting fiercely and the American progress is very slow. Supreme Allied Headquarters in Paris says it has no confirmation of the report that Heinrich Himmler has been seized in northern Germany, but an Allied officer who has returned from the front says it's true. General Eisenhower has asked the United Nations War Crimes Commission to send 4 teams into Germany at once. Now for our first switch to a Columbia correspondent abroad, Admiral takes you to London. Douglas Edwards reporting.
The next episode in Britain's victory celebration comes less than a half hour from now when Prime Minister Churchill speaks to his home nation and the world. Columbia will broadcast the Prime Minister's address at 3 p.m. Eastern Wartime. Mr. Churchill is expected to review the war years, the years in which he led Great Britain out of sore and trying times into victory at the side of our own country in Russia. 1,500 fighters and heavy bombers of the American 8th Air Force are right now flying over southern England in a great victory salute, and also in tribute to their commander, Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle, the man who first bombed Tokyo. And now for a first-hand description of that mighty aerial victory demonstration, we take you high up on a London rooftop. Edward R. Murrow reporting.
We're standing on top of a familiar roof high over London, and the reports have it that about 1,500 American bombers and fighters are now flying in tight formation somewhere over southern England. As a matter of fact, the only aircraft we have seen in the air in the course of the last minute and a half up here has been one B-17 going very low and very fast, apparently trying to join his formation. We're standing on a rooftop that was very familiar in the old days during the Blitz, and all over this city one can see the Union Jack and the Stars and Stripes standing stiff in a breeze in the cool of the Sunday evening here in London. About 15 minutes ago, we could hear the sound of this great air armada off in the distance, but at the moment, it is impossible to see them. Just down to the right, I can see a Swiss flag flying, a Danish. On down the way, the flag of China. Just here beside me is a huge Union Jack. They're rather soft, dark clouds being almost whipped over London this evening, and I should think that this great demonstration of American air strength is probably down somewhere near the south coast now. Off in the distance, down in that direction, I can just see the glint of the setting sun on silver wings, but there have been so many aircraft flying low over London in the course of the day that it's impossible to tell whether or not what I see is in fact part of this great aerial demonstration or whether it's just a few odd planes down there. Down in the distance, one can see the dome of St. Paul's, the evening sun glinting off it. Occasionally, one sees those dull, dark gaps in the buildings where bombs struck and where incendiaries came down. As a matter of fact, it was never planned for this great aerial demonstration to come over the center of London. They were going to swing wide of it at a distance of about 10 or 15 miles, and I think they crossed over South London just about 5 or 10 minutes before this broadcast began.
That was Edward R. Murrow in London, and now in New York, here again is Warren Sweeney.
With practically everybody collecting their favorite music on records, you'll certainly want one of the many beautiful post-war Admiral radio phonographs with automatic record changers.
I do want an automatic record changer, but I'm not very mechanical-minded. Will the Admiral be simple to operate?
Yes, it certainly will. The new Admiral automatic record changer will be so foolproof and trouble-free that it's going to set a new high in musical enjoyment. The Admiral will have only 3 moving parts. Just 3. Right there is the secret of Admiral's trouble-free operation. There just won't be anything to get out of adjustment to the new Admiral automatic changer. So, if you want a really fine radio phonograph with an automatic record changer that will give you years and years of carefree enjoyment, make yours an Admiral, America's smart set. Now, here once again, is Robert Trout.
CBS correspondent Larry LeSueur has just returned to Paris from a visit to Austria, where he spent some time with the Red Army. For his story, Admiral takes you to CBS Paris. Larry LeSueur reporting.
Yesterday, I was in Russian-occupied Austria. This isn't the first time that the Eastern influence has made its way up the fertile valley of the Danube, because in the little white villages that stud the green Austrian hills, you can see the tulip-domed minarets of ancient churches that mark the high tide of Byzantine influence in the Middle Ages. The Austrian people under Russian occupation were an expression little different from those in the American zone. It's one of resignation. But still, there are as many of the red and white flags of free Austria waving from the windows in the Russian zone as in ours. My Jeep threaded its way among the abandoned German trucks that were left stranded when the German army fled panic-stricken from the Russians into our lines. A long line of Russian tanks came up and smashed and shoved them into the ditch. That was a far cry from the Russian front in 1942, when I used to see every abandoned German truck guarded like gold, and Russian salvage crews working frantically on them. The Red Army has all the equipment it needs now. But strangely enough, the only American equipment I saw, aside from a few trucks, were Jeeps. The tanks were Russian-made and heavier than our own Shermans. The Russian tank men were the youngest men I've ever seen in tanks. They could scarcely be over 18. I asked one of the Russian youngsters what he thought of the Austrians. He said the Austrian people were all right, but the Austrian soldiers had acted very badly in the Ukraine. Personally, he was a little contemptuous about the way the Austrian civilians had replaced the white surrender flags with the red and white flags of free Austria a few hours after the Red Army entered. He showed me some of the Russian occupation money for Austria. It looked very much like American occupation money, and it said nothing about Russia at all, simply Allied military government. Vienna, he said, was fairly gay and not very much damaged. And as far as I could see, there were no rules against the Russians fraternizing with the Austrians. Long lines of Russian slave workers on foot and in horse-drawn carts were making their way eastward, liberated. Such a ragtag procession you never saw before. Some driving German trucks, some on bicycles, and all that was colorful and picturesque in Russia came by. Some with the slanted eyes of the East, others with the blue eyes and fair hair of the Ukraine. Unarmed and dejected, German prisoners were making their way in little bands, unguarded, to the prison cages. Russian soldiers passed them by without notice. But for me, it was hard to realize that the long war was over, because even as I watched, I saw 3 Russian refugees badly wounded when their horse-drawn cart collided with a German truck that had been purposely left behind blocking the road. It had been booby-trapped by the Germans. And this is Larry LeSueur returning you now to Admiral in New York.
Next, for a summary of developments in the war against Japan, Admiral takes you to CBS San Francisco, Major George Fielding Elliott reporting.
In observing the attempts of the Japanese Air Force to interfere with the American operations on Okinawa Island, we should bear in mind the progressive decline and final death of Germany's Luftwaffe. And we should realize that much the same factors are at work against the Japanese air power. First, its industrial sources of supply are under heavy attack. Next, its outside fuel supplies have been cut off, and its internal fuel supplies, synthetic plants, and oil storage are also being hit. Finally, its planes and pilots are being destroyed in the air and on the ground on an increasing scale. When it accepts combat, it is always forced to fight greatly superior forces. It has one disadvantage which did not trouble the Luftwaffe to the same extent. It is inferior to its opponents not only in numbers, but also in quality, both of machines and personnel. The Japanese Air Force has already been reduced to the point where it cannot carry out strategic operations of any kind. It has no power to take the offensive. It can only try to counter our blows after those blows have been delivered or are in course of being delivered. Its attempts to do even this are growing feebler and feebler. Obsolete planes and very hastily trained pilots are in evidence. The suicide method of attack is causing some damage to our shipping, but this is a sort of air warfare which is suicidal in more senses than one. It results in a rate of loss which no air force can endure, especially one whose production is diminishing rapidly and which, therefore, needs to conserve its strength rather than to recklessly expend it. According to available estimates, the Japanese production of aircraft has been more than cut in half since the beginning of this year by our B-29 attacks. The total now is estimated at hardly more than 1,000 a month, including trainers. And since March 18th, when the attacks on Okinawa began, the Japanese have lost more than 3,000 aircraft in this area alone, or just a little more than twice the number they produced in that period. That's a process that can't go on indefinitely. And now, here in San Francisco is George Murad, one of Columbia's news analysts, with news of the conference and a special interview.
Here at the security conference, most of the delegates are getting their first short breathing spell since the discussions opened. Anthony Eden left for Washington early this morning. His successor as chief delegate, Lord Halifax, is visiting Nevada for the weekend, and most of the rest are making a tour of the Golden Gate in lovely sunny weather. But the important story still is that American delegates seem to have found at least a compromise solution for regional security pacts, such as the Chapultepec Agreement. Under this new plan, regional groups could take action for defense in emergency, but later the World Organization would take over. Now, everyone has been wondering how this compromise would suit the Russians, with their particular interest in the Balkan Federation. Well, it seems to be all right, because the Moscow newspaper Izvestia says that the former proposals of Latin American countries to exclude their problems from the world body were a complete deviation from Dumbarton Oaks. This is especially dangerous, Izvestia said, because precisely in certain Latin American countries, for example, the Argentine, fascists are operating impudently and even enjoying special favors. So this compromise plan, which definitely subordinates the Pan-American bloc, should satisfy Russia and, in fact, block any other independent regional group which may emerge. Now, you've probably heard from most of the various interests at this conference, all except one, that quiet but all-important delegation of men who are fighting the war. To get the soldiers' viewpoint, Commander Harold Stassen has with him two military aides and advisors, Lieutenant Cord Meyer, Jr., a Marine veteran of the South Pacific, and Sergeant John Thompson, who fought in Normandy. And here now is Lieutenant Meyer.
In the first place, I think the American soldier, and any soldier, more deeply desires peace than the average civilian. He knows more vividly the terrible power of modern war, and he is ready, I think, to make more sacrifice, say to serve in an international police force, if one can be formed. But I think the soldier is realistic and even skeptical. He deeply desires a strong international organization, but is doubtful if the various nations are ready to take the radical steps and changes necessary.
Well, would you be more specific, Cord, say about trusteeships of Pacific Islands?
Yes, I think it's clear that the American delegation is seeking to acquire strategic Pacific islands through and under processes of international law. If we establish complete sovereignty by outright seizure, we would have no basis for complaint if other nations adopt the same policy. Say Britain with regard to Hainan or Truk, or Russia in respect to Korea and Port Arthur.
And now what about regional pacts and geographical blocks?
Here again is this very strong tendency toward narrow national interests, which comes, I suppose, out of a desire for security in the most obvious, quickest way. But it seems to me a poor trade. From the viewpoint of power politics, if we sponsor a Latin American group over and above the World Organization, we encourage other nations to build regional groups that could be far more powerful than ours.
Well, Cord, what do you suppose the average soldier knows or thinks about this conference?
Well, I suppose he's confused, as most of us are, by all the oratory and side issues. But I think the soldier and all of us should know that the aims of this conference are very definitely limited. I think this conference hopes only to create some machinery through which nations can keep contact and work together to find peaceful solutions in post-war difficulties. It should be understood that Dumbarton Oaks, and no doubt this agreement, doesn't meet the basic problem of avoiding war. Dumbarton Oaks was just a small and cautious step. This, we hope, is a greater stride. As of now, the big nations retain their complete sovereignty, and through their veto power, reserve the right to exclude themselves from any decision the Security Council might take. We've got to accept this because it's all we've got. I think we should be critically aware of the limitations of this agreement we are making, but we should be determined to go on from here to a real international trust and effective peace machinery.
Well, thank you, Lieutenant Cord Meyer, Jr., who is Commander Harold Stassen's military aide and advisor to give the soldiers' viewpoint on the San Francisco Security Conference. This is George Murad in San Francisco. I return you now to Admiral in New York.
President Truman has fired the first shot in a new psychological warfare campaign against the Japanese. For details, Admiral takes you to CBS Washington, Tris Coffin reporting.
I found out this afternoon that the United States has thrown into high gear a dramatic psychological campaign against Japan. Our target is the Japanese leaders. Our purpose, to save lives and hasten the day of unconditional surrender. This campaign is no crackpot scheme. It has been okayed by such conservative-minded men as President Truman, his Chief of Staff, Admiral Leahy, Admiral King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, and Acting Secretary of State Grew. President Truman kicked off the campaign on VE Day. He read a statement to his news conference telling the Japanese just what to expect if they stayed in the war, and the terms for unconditional surrender. President Truman hammered one main point. The Japs have a choice: devastation of their country or a surrender which does not mean enslavement or extermination. As a part of the campaign, Captain Ellis N. Zacharias, for some time our naval attaché in Tokyo, will broadcast twice a week to Japan. He personally knows the enemy high command and cabinet and will speak to them in Japanese. According to those officials in Washington who have planned this strategy, there is a fair chance of dividing and weakening the Japanese command. They say there are two dominant groups in Japan, the young fanatics and the great financiers and manufacturing families. There is sufficient information in Washington to indicate the latter are even now tired of the war and afraid of its consequences. This campaign is, of course, only a part of the combined strategy and is being fed into the military and naval pattern. I return you to Admiral in New York.
Dispatches from Moscow we've received here in New York tell us that the chief concern of the Russians this weekend is a quick arraignment of Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Goering, Franz von Papen, and Rudolf Hess as war criminals and a stepped-up manhunt for other missing German leaders. This is the day of prayer. On both sides of the Atlantic, the Allied peoples are giving solemn thanks for the victory. The accomplished fact of unconditional surrender is less than a week old, but already it is clear that this is a victory to be welcomed with a measure of solemnity and sober thought. There's still shooting in parts of Europe. Militarily, this last-ditch fight of the surrounded Germans is of little or no importance. But it does have value as a symbol of the way in which defeat has come to Germany and the manner in which Germany is accepting it. The truth is that in 1945, the mood of defeated Germany in many ways bears an ominous similarity to the mood of defeated Germany in 1918. On the part of the German leaders, there is the same attempt to picture themselves as very decent fellows, really, who were simply doing their duty and would never willingly harm a fly. On the part of the German people, there is the same powerful impulse to ignore the fact that starting a war is a crime and to search for some excuse for the defeat. Both the leaders and the people are seeking to point the finger at someone else. It was not they, but someone else, they say, who is responsible for beginning the war and now for losing it. And it was someone else who smashed all the unwritten laws of warfare and committed atrocities of a quality and quantity unknown before this to the modern world. These German reactions to defeat might have been expected. There's been nothing in the German history of the past century which would have led us to expect anything else. But there's another tendency among the German people which, although it parallels a German mood of 1918, has caused some surprise in the Allied world. Many ordinary Germans are telling American correspondents that they no longer hold Adolf Hitler in high regard, and some German generals have issued statements implying that the German army could have won were it not for the interference of the Nazi Party. This German scorn for the Nazi Party, whether real or pretended, has astonished those Allied observers who expected the trouble in post-war Germany to come from the Nazi Party and from those Germans who refused to forsake it. But the trouble in Germany after the First World War did not come particularly from the Germans who refused to forsake the Kaiser and the form of government which he represented. There were many Germans in 1918 who were eager to announce their dislike of the imperial German government and the Kaiser, who had forgotten his dignity in his wild flight to neutral territory. Less than a week after the victory, the evidence now indicates that if the Nazi Party continues as an important force in German life, it will do so under a different name and under the guidance of different Germans. The swastika and the salute of the outstretched arm are vanishing, and no one seems more eager to make them disappear than the Germans. The German generals and civilian officials plainly consider the old party customs and labels an embarrassing burden, and many of the ordinary German people apparently would like to forget the party that brought them so many triumphs but failed to bring them the last victory. All this has happened before, a quarter of a century ago, and for the citizens of the United Nations, who are so eager today to prevent history from repeating itself any further in the years to come, there is reason indeed to greet the victory with prayer and with solemn thought. And now to tell you about a post-war refrigerator with a built-in ultraviolet ray lamp to kill bacteria, here is Warren Sweeney.
It's the Admiral Sterilamp in the post-war Admiral Dual Temp refrigerator. Low temperature alone cannot always prevent food from spoiling. Mold and gradual decay are proof that bacteria are present. But in the Admiral Dual Temp, the scientific protection produced by Admiral Sterilamp will destroy bacteria on exposed food surfaces and in the surrounding air. Foods will stay fresh and wholesome for a longer period. The ultraviolet rays from the Admiral Sterilamp are as safe as sunshine. Their sanitizing action retards mold growth, reduces spoilage due to bacteria, and combats odors. You'll find this Admiral Sterilamp only in the post-war Admiral Dual Temp, the refrigerator that is really two refrigerators in one. First, the built-in freezing locker in the Admiral Dual Temp will actually quick freeze foods or store frozen foods safely for months. Then, there's the extra-large purified moist cold compartment with Admiral Sterilamp protection. In this compartment, foods will stay fresh and moist in uncovered dishes, and it never has to be defrosted. Yes, the successor to the ordinary mechanical refrigerator will certainly be Dual Temp by Admiral. Even to the millions of servicemen still in Europe, and certainly to those in the Pacific, nothing is more important to their morale than mail, and lots of it. V-mail is ideal for short, frequent letters, and was designed to save precious cargo space. Give your serviceman or woman a lift by writing V-mail today. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's Smart Set, and post-war makers of Admiral dual temp refrigerators, Admiral home freezers, Admiral electric ranges. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave direct from leading news centers of the world. This is